Welcome to the joint City Council and Utility Advisory Committee workshop agenda. I'd like to call the meeting to order, and with posting and roll call, please.
Thank you. The agenda was posted in accordance with open meeting law. We have all members of City Council present. Utility Advisory Committee, we have 3 members absent, which are Eileen Wilkinson, Lloyd Anderson, there's Ned Shamo. There's not another one. Yeah, that's it. Those members are missing, but they do have a quorum.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Before we have public comment, let's rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We'll open the meeting up for public comment, and public comment is for this portion of the agenda must be limited to matters on the agenda, and each person will have up to 5 minutes to speak on a specific agenda item. Call-in number will be 702-589-9629 for those who wish to call in. Do we have any written that have come in?
No written comments were submitted.
Thank you. We'll invite all those who would like to come in at this point and come up and address the groups. Seeing none, we'll wait a moment for the call-in number to be available. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hearing none, seeing none, we'll move on to the workshop agenda. And we'll first hear a presentation by Raftalis. And if you can come forward and identify yourself for the record and proceed. And yes, you can have somebody else come up with you if you want to.
No, I just didn't know if he had any introductory comments, but
Would you like to be introduced?
no, I can introduce myself.
Okay.
Hi.
Thank
Hi,
you.
I'm Colin Dratt with Raftalis. I'm the project manager for the rate study. And go ahead and call up the slides. There we go. Okay, so just an agenda as far as what the slides cover. It's a workshop. We can obviously sort of break out into discussion kind of throughout as needed, but I do have some slides to sort of facilitate the discussion and sort of provide an overview of our findings and recommendations with regard to the study. So just in terms of an agenda, we'll talk about what we're focused on in terms of the study, a summary of some of the recommendations, look at the financial plans, which really determine the overall level of revenue that we need the rates to generate, and then talk a little bit about how that revenue could be generated with our rate structures. So our volume charges, our fixed charges, our charges per kilowatt hour, those sorts of things, how those break down, and recommendations for potentially adjusting those to align with the objectives of the city. We'll look at some example bill impacts and then cover next steps. So just in terms of focus areas, when we talk about doing a rate study, there are really sort of three pieces, and we're kind of focused on two of them. The first one is determining the overall level of revenue you need for each fund. So we're looking at projecting expenditures, revenues, and ensuring that we have a financially sustainable fund for the electric fund, water, wastewater, and then solid waste is included as well. But we're really looking at projecting our expenses, projecting our revenues, and ensuring that our revenues are aligned with those projected expenditures so that we can be funding our expenses, repairing and replacing our capital infrastructure, and doing that in a financially sustainable manner. So it's determining the overall kind of size of the pie is the way I'd like to think about it. And then the second sort of step that's often done in a rate study is a cost of service analysis or cost of service study. And that really looks at the different types of customers, different types of customers in the system, be it residential or commercial customers, how they use the system, how that informs how the system's designed and operated, and really looks to align the cost of providing service with the demands that each customer class places on the system. So it's examining the usage characteristics of the different types of customers. So we're not really getting into that this time. We did look at that during the last study. The third step is the rate structure step, which is actually looking at the structures that we have and potential modifications which recover the same amount of revenue identified in the financial plan by fund, but adjust things to align with our objectives. So there might be things related to net metering, changes to the structures to encourage conservation, considerations regarding revenue stability, and that sort of thing. In general, what we're focused on is really the overall level of revenue and kind of tweaking the rate structures to make sure that they align with our objectives. We're not shifting how much revenue we're getting between the different types of customers, but really working within the existing structures and modifying them.
And if I may, are you willing to have questions while we're
Yeah,
going
absolutely.
on?
Yes, throughout is fine.
So I'm going to look for our Utility Advisory Committee Chair, particularly to bring up things that need clarifying, as well as our Utility Committee members, as well as our City Council. So if there are things that you see that need to be clarified for you as we go, don't hesitate to let me know, and we can recognize you, and appreciate your willingness to do that.
Yeah.
At the same time, if we can look at what we're going to be hearing and have those questions pertaining that we're going to be hearing come up when that happens. So we don't want to ask a question necessarily that you're going to answer in the next page.
Sure.
Or you can say, that's in the next page.
It's coming.
Okay,
Yeah,
is that
sure.
okay, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair?
then that's why I've tried to lay mine out to be related to that. If it's later on, I try to hold it off to that.
All right.
And again, if I am mistaken, then I'll be happy to wait.
Yeah.
But on this one, if I could ask a question, because I believe this is the only point that the multifamily billing is brought up. And what that relates to is in the water rate resolution, it's residential B, section B, residential B. And the terminology or the resolution got changed in 2016. Prior to that, it clearly stated that you had a certain aspect related to a residential unit and then the meter. Well, it wasn't clearly about the meter, but at least you had a term in there that said residential unit. So I think some of the cases in this case, what we're looking at, so I'm sorry, I'll take a little bit of time here just so because we need to look at it more in the future. I'm not sure what we can do here, but hopefully we can start modifying the resolution to make it clear or try to get something back to residential unit. When you're talking about RV parks, and because that's what this relates to, it relates to apartments, RV parks, and trailers. When you're looking at 50 to 100 different units, and they're being charged the full meter rate at this time, that seems like a high amount. So looking at history, I went back and looked at some of the old ones, and they were charged a rate, but as of 2016, that rate went up drastically. And so I think if we just go back and try to figure out what we want to do, and as Collins had said, the rate structure and the new rates, unbundling it, has a lot of issues going forward. Well, not issues, a lot of things we need to understand. So what we have is you have three major rates. You have a wholesale rate, and then you have a service charge, which is considered the fixed charge, and then we'll have a delivery charge. So the wholesale charge is what it says, you're collecting the wholesale back, and the service charge and the delivery charge are going to collect all your other costs. So right now, you have the service charge related to a meter, and so then that charge is also related to this multifamily. So making a short story very long, I'm just trying to get a point that understanding all the components to try to get to we can be fair to the citizens that are on that Schedule B.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Proceed.
Sure. So what I have listed here are initial recommendations and then revisions sort of following our meeting with the UAC. So that column on the left is essentially what we brought to that meeting. And then the column
Now,
on the
if you
right.
could do me a favor and not use abbreviations. Public utility.
Oh, I'm sorry, Utility Advisory
Okay,
Committee.
so if you,
Absolutely.
so
Yes,
I see a lot of abbreviations there.
Yes.
That would help old people.
absolutely. Sorry about
Explain
that.
'em.
Yes.
Thank you.
So the initial recommendations are what we brought to the Utilities Advisory Committee meeting. So you're kind of just going down the list there. The first few are focused on that financial planning aspect, which is sort of the overall revenue that's needed for the fund. And then the last few are focused more on the structuring piece. So overall, we were looking at revenue increases for each fund. I don't know why okay, now it's back. And we'll dig into a little bit about the why there. Maintaining our fund balance over the 20% sort of minimum requirement. So we have a financial policy that says, our fund balance needs to be at least 20% of our operating expenditures. So what we're saying is, let's not draw it down all the way down to that minimum because there's a lot of uncertainty around power supply costs, things related to potential water restrictions, that sort of thing. So we want to leave ourselves room and not sort of draw that all the way down to the minimum. No additional payments on the raw water line debt. So in the prior study, one of the things we were examining was paying off that debt early. And given that, the shift in sort of the interest rate environment, that interest rate is very, very low relative to current interest rates. So there's not as much of a benefit to paying that off early, given that, we can earn more interest on that money than we're actually paying. So that was the recommendation there. Unbundle power supply and purchase water costs from the electric and water rates, and we'll dig into the details on that. but really just separating out the cost that we can control for our system versus the cost that we're essentially sort of price takers on. Restructuring the block rates for electric and water to encourage conservation, looking at the service charges. So right now on water, we have service charges by meter size. And so the larger your meter, the more you pay for that fixed service charge. One observation from the prior study that we had kind of carried forward in these discussions was that those seemed a little bit out of whack in terms of the actual capacity of the meter. So that was something we identified that could potentially be addressed. So the reason you have a higher charge for a bigger meter is it represents greater potential demand on the system based on the capacity of the meter. But when you actually look at the meters we have, those large meters have much, much higher charges relative to their capacity. So that was a potential change that we identified. No change to the city rates, and basically what that means is right now the city pays wholesale. They pay for the wholesale cost of power and water. And one of the things that we had sort of investigated before was, would it make sense for the city to go ahead and pay the full rate like a regular retail customer? So at this time, we were recommending just leaving that as the wholesale rate. And the reason for that being that while it's true the city doesn't pay the full rate that all the other customers pay, there are services sort of provided by other city departments to the utilities fund that aren't completely recognized. So it's really just making sure that that's all balanced out. And just one note on that particular policy is that approach sort of ranges across communities. So there are some that don't charge their city departments anything for utilities, and there are some which charge them the commercial rate. And there are a bunch that are in between, sort of like what we do. And then just looking at the net metering and just making sure that we're recovering our costs appropriately from those customers. So we do save on obviously purchasing the power when customers generate their own power, but we still have all of our fixed costs basically to distribute the power to customers. So just making sure that that policy is appropriate.
So what does MM mean?
And then millions of dollars. Yes.
Millions?
Thousands.
Okay,
Can I?
Yep.
go ahead.
So on two of the things, on the recommendation on number 6, just for clarification, and that's one of the reasons I pushed strongly for a rate structure look instead of a cost of service, is that in fiscal year 2017, when the rates were raised from 2017 to 2019, the service charge was raised 104% for the residential and 84% for the commercial. So what happened was you go down to those large meters, you take 84% of that at the end, and now you don't really, in my opinion, you don't have the same amount relating to what you started with. Do you see what I'm saying? You've taken that percentage and you've drawn out that amount. You've got the amount that you need for Boulder City, you have the amount you need for SNWA. Both of those have been combined and multiplied by a percentage. So you've lost some of your rate structure aspect. So I think that's another, in my opinion, that's some of the confusion of why those meters are so high. And so I think it needs to be looked at a little bit more, broken out a little bit and looked at. So I just wanted to bring that to focus. For the city, I think all the committee, we all agree that the city does get, we only believe the city should pay wholesale, but we believe they should pay the full wholesale cost. There was a little confusion during the first meeting, so we think we got that clarified. But both of the current resolutions have the city paying the wholesale, but the electrical's a little confusing because it's like we're going to pay last year's. We're going to pay an average of the last year. So that might want to be modified in that it's saying if we're paying an estimated cost, the city might pay its estimated cost of wholesale like everybody else, and it's cleaner. So I think some of the recommendations might be, and I think as we go forward, that's the reason I'm bringing it up now, then we can sort of think about that. And since the city does get benefit, and we are only doing the wholesale cost by raising the, so that's what this increased central fee by $225,000 in 25. Every year we've been seeing we have 3 admin funds that I can talk about later that was in the spreadsheet that is in the handout. So we might want to talk about it later. So I think we need to look at the costs that the cities are increasing, because at this slide alone, it almost looks like you're just taking the increase of the full cost and just passing it on to the ratepayer. So that's just one thing I want to be careful of.
What I will do is I'll go to page 28 of your presentation and remind us all that this isn't the end of this process. We have the Utility Advisory Commission that's meeting on May 3rd to take action on what they do, and then on May 9th, that comes to the City Council. And then on May 26th, it's a public hearing and adoption of the budget and resolutions. So this is the first bite at that apple, if you would. And so I'm appreciative of you being here, Mr. Chair, because you're taking good notes. And we'll bring them back to all of you, and then to us, and then to everybody. So it is a process, and we appreciate you working us through that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, that's sort of what we brought to that first meeting, and then we had a discussion, and then we took away some feedback. I think we were comfortable, generally speaking, with those first three. So those were maintained in what you see here. One of the things that was sort of identified as a potential concern was just making sure that, we're not adding too much complexity and making sure that folks can still understand the rate structures in light of the unbundling aspect. So one of the things we decided to do was really focus on the power supply unbundling as opposed to trying to pull out the SNWA stuff from the water. Obviously, we do that on the bill. That component is already kind of pulled out on the bill. It's also a little bit more consequential on electric because the costs can vary a lot more significantly. So rather than trying to make a lot of changes, just this seemed like a good change to sort of start with there, focusing on power supply. The other concern that the committee had raised is when we were looking at restructuring the blocks, just the impact on users in the summer that just happened to have higher summer usage, but they weren't really above average in the summer. It's just the usage goes up in the summer. So just making sure that we're sending that conservation signal really to the biggest users that are really kind of above and beyond, way above average, as opposed to pushing too much on more of the average user in the summer, both on electric and water. So kind of dialing that back a little bit. So that's on 5. And then just on 6, and Larry alluded to some of this, but just maybe we need to dig a little bit more into the meter size stuff and how that might be structured. But one thing we can do now is potentially simplify and clarify the resolution on the service charges. We talked about multifamily. That's one potential issue. The other thing that's a little unusual with the resolution is that it identifies very specific costs that go into the service charge. It says the service charge will cover X, Y, Z, which is not typically what you see. Typically, it's just there will be a service charge. It will be X per month based on meter size. And it really leaves up to the sort of discretion to set what that level is. And it doesn't mean that you can't have a very specific way of setting it and communicate that to folks. But having that called out in the resolution is a little unusual. The other thing the reason to simplify it too is if it's in the resolution, we kind of need to make sure that it just includes those things, and there's some uncertainty about whether it specifically, it probably includes at least those costs, but whether anyone's actually looked and said, if A, B, and C are in there, are A, B, and C actually, is that what makes up that charge? So the solution to that is probably rather than getting into a real detailed accounting analysis to fit the resolution, maybe just simplify it, make it a little more standard. We did have the residential customer charge going up over time, over the sort of 5-year period. And the thought there was maybe if it's going to end a little bit higher, just go ahead and sort of bump it up to where it's going to be and then keep it flat. That was a recommendation. So we've done that. And then, so there's some sort of stability there. And then obviously city per the resolution, pays the wholesale costs, so we've, made sure that that's incorporated appropriately there. And then the other conversation, I think that, we think needs to be investigated a little more is just making sure that that balance between, the services that the city provides to the utilities and make sure that that cost is sort of appropriately recovered by the funds. In the end, it's all the city, but just making sure that we have, we're recognizing those services that are provided that the utility would essentially, if they didn't have those centrally provided services from the general fund, they'd have to go out and hire, those folks on their own. So there's some economies of scale and efficiencies with having one person serve multiple funds or departments. So that's definitely the way to do it. But just making sure that sort of allocation of costs is appropriate. So that sort of reimbursement was higher at some point in the past, and we've just included sort of bumping it up starting in fiscal '25. But I think in general, we wanted to recognize the impact of potentially doing that, but maybe the more important thing is it might be worth digging into what is sort of an appropriate overhead allocation to the utilities, recognizing the people that serve them. So it's not so much about the number, we did increase it, but just making sure that we investigate that. So you can look at, who's involved, what do they do, what do they spend their time on, kind of processes and how many of each thing are done. So there are lots of ways of looking at that, but just making sure that when we've got a number for that reimbursement that we're sort of comfortable with it.
I will say, when you say you increased it, you recommended an increase.
Yes.
Thank you.
It's incorporated into the recommendations. That's right.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I have a couple questions. On number 5, how do you determine normal user and the increase in the summer that qualifies somebody as a normal user?
That's a good question. So we dug into the data. What we do is we look at sort of a frequency distribution of bills. So just how many bills are at each usage level, and you can look at that annually. You can look at it by month. We looked at it in the summer and in the winter. So we're really looking at, and we'll get into this a little bit when we actually get it to the rate restructuring piece of it. But there are lots of ways to think about it. You could say, well, if you look at sort of the hottest month or the highest usage month, maybe it's July or August, what's sort of the average usage for that? And then if you're above average, that's potentially higher than normal. Or you could look at a percentile, which is the way we looked at the top, setting the top block. So the highest block that we're recommending is actually set at the 95th percentile in the summer. So you can be pretty sure that if someone uses that in the summer, that's a very high user. If they use it in the winter, then they're going to be in the top, 0.5% of winter bills. So that's sort of the way we think about that.
Fair enough. So there are multiple potential ways
That's right.
to do that calculation,
Yep.
and that's the one that we've come up with.
Right. And the other way that, and again, we'll get to it, but the other way to think about it, and this works pretty well for water especially, is just what's sort of an indoor usage sort of assumption for a certain family size. So if you have, 50 gallons per person per day for a family of 3, that's about a little less than 4,000 gallons. So you know that, for an average sort of residence, if they're above 4, then likely some of that's going to be outdoor usage. If they're at 25,000.
Can I interrupt you right there?
Yep.
In Boulder City, we don't differentiate between indoor and outdoor usage because none of it gets reclaimed, right?
Right.
So there's no differentiation right now. It's all just going through the meter, and we don't know what's indoors and what's outdoors.
Right, and I think it's just recognizing how the water is used. So if you're encouraging conservation, you don't want to set the block so low that it's just people that get penalized basically for having a larger family. So that's sort of one way to think about it, is to say, okay, we know how much people use indoors.
You think you know how much
Well,
people
you
use
estimate
indoors.
you can estimate how much they use indoors. And then if it's above that, you start thinking about, okay, does it make sense to use your rate structure? And you certainly don't have to do this, but we have a rate structure that is intended to encourage conservation at those higher usage levels.
So if I'm hearing you right, I'm going to shift gears to water then.
Sure.
are you in this, are we considering then an estimated indoor use and putting our tiers based off of what we think that should be for a household without taking into account the number of humans in that household or what, just an average indoor use?
Yeah, it's used to inform where that first block is set. So right now it's at 8,000. So if you're below 8,000, you get the lowest rate. So the question is, if it's 8,000, why is it 8,000? So what we said is, okay, well, let's dig into what is and that's often how those first blocks are set, is what sort of indoor, non-discretionary, essential usage for human health, effectively, at, and 50 gallons per person per day is a pretty typical standard for that, and that gets you 3,750 for a household of 3. So the 5,000 allows a little beyond that for, slightly larger families. But even when we get to the structure above 5, it's not like the rate triples or anything. It's a little bit higher, and then it goes up from there.
Okay, I'll jump off that now.
Sure, yeah.
And really quick, well, now I might have forgotten where I was going with that next question because of where we went with that.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. One-time increase to the residential electric customer charge, that's what I had highlighted, but I think you've already answered that. So I'll
Yeah.
yield back to
Oh,
you
sure.
for,
No.
thanks.
In my book, where I'm kind of getting confused on this, a family of 10 versus a family of 3, how are you deciding which direction to go with that? It seems to me that we're penalizing people, we're penalizing people that are larger families, and we shouldn't really be doing that, versus maybe a senior couple?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'd say to that is the structure doesn't increase that much above 5,000, so it is higher. And the other thing we have to keep in mind is we have a higher rate above 8,000 now. So we've sort of made a decision as to where that level should be drawn, and what we're saying is that that struck us, the 8,000 struck us as sort of high for what you typically see, which is indoor usage for an average family size. But it's not like if you have a family of 6, your bill doubles. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
So it's just, and some of it's, you have to look at the scale of how much usage you're actually talking about. I mean, you'd have to have a very large family to have a 45,000 gallon bill, which is where our top tier is.
Okay. It just sounded scary to the larger families, the way you were wording that.
Right.
Thank you for the clarification.
Absolutely.
If I can add another comment, the challenge here is that even when we do begin to reclaim the indoor use, we don't know how much per household, right? We don't know how much the household is sending back.
Right.
And so that's really a challenge, and I do know some, matter of fact, in my family, I have some larger families, a lot of grandchildren, and so to put them in an average usage with my household, empty nesters, and to charge them a higher rate for what we believe is being indoor use, which will be reclaimed, seems a difficult hurdle for me. So that's a concern I just wanted to throw out there.
Sure.
So help us understand that
Yep.
along the journey.
Yep.
Thanks.
Thank you. Proceed.
Okay. So just in terms of the financial planning, this provides an overview of the process that I described earlier. So we're forecasting our revenue. If we don't make any changes to our rates, what would we expect that sort of baseline revenue to be? And then looking at our operating and capital expenditures, projecting those over a 5-year period, and then essentially comparing the two to see if our revenues are adequate to meet our expenditures. Just some considerations on that. I mentioned that minimum balance. We do have fund balance in excess of the 20% now. So we can use that money to pay for predominantly capital expenditures and reduce the impact on the rates. And we'll look at a graph that kind of demonstrates this. But if your existing revenues are here and your expenses are here, then you have a gap that needs to be made up. And you could do that by increasing your revenues. But if you have funds available already, you can use those and not have to be able to smooth into that adjustment, basically, and that's what we're recommending. The recommendations look at the funds as a whole. So we're making adjustments to each fund, but in terms of that kind of financial metric, the 20%, we're really focused on all four of the funds and what they look like combined. They do envision unbundling the power supply cost from the electric rates. And basically what that means is we're assuming that we're going to set that energy charge to recover what we believe our electric costs will be budgeted for that year. So we'll basically be passing that through. We do have, yes.
So that fee, would you look at that every year? Would you look at that fee every year or every other year? How would you be recommending that you look at that fee of going up and down?
Yeah, so there's different ways to do that, and again, we'll touch on that in more detail later. But there are, utilities that adjust it more frequently than annually. Some have what's called a power cost adjustment, and that might happen quarterly or even monthly. That's not what we're recommending here. I think we envisioned changing it annually. One benefit that we have here is we get a budget each year, and that's what our costs will be. Now, there are some things that are kind of shifting and, that could potentially impact that in terms of, just rising electric costs and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, we get a budget, and that's our cost. So we can set a rate basically around that unit cost. And next year, the following year, you'd get a new budget, and you could adjust that rate at that time. And really, it's just making sure that rate is set at a level and can be adjusted to recover the costs as they change.
So one way that I'm going to bring up in a couple of those slides, and as we go through, it'd be helpful, because right now we have a large cost increase in 2024. And there'd be discussion in the further one about a recovery of this year's additional costs. If we do have a very large amount this year and next year, then a suggestion would be to take an average of the next 3 years and take that average and use that. And so you just sort of say for the next 3 years, we would use that as a wholesale cost. So that it's similar to what he's saying. So as we go through, I'd like to sort of bring that up, because right now that's looking at 6.1 cents, and I'd recommend 6.2 cents. That way it sort of brings it out a little bit and allows the city to recover a little more money. So bring that up. But if that helps you to sort of see a way of doing it.
And we'll talk about.
Okay, we got a
Sorry.
couple of the.
Yep.
Make sure that's also stated, that's wholesale cost, not retail.
Correct.
Okay, so that has to be understood. That's the new wholesale cost we're proposing. Okay, so that's what we're talking about, not retail. Retail's a different number.
Thanks.
Proceed.
So just in terms of forecasting that baseline revenue, we talked about unbundling, and basically the impact of that is we're assuming we're going to set that component of our revenue to match the cost. The other things that impact us are growth in customer accounts, and as well as changes in customer usage. Digging into the unbundling a little bit, we'll go into that a little bit more detail later. But basically, as Larry kind of alluded to, and that's disappearing at the wrong time, we basically have two charges now. We have a customer charge for electric, and then we have a usage charge per kilowatt hour, and then larger commercial customers have a demand charge, but no residential customers have a demand charge. So what we're saying is we'd basically have a customer charge, an energy rate that recovers our power supply cost, and a delivery charge which recovers our sort of internal cost to deliver the power outside of the power supply. So the current projections assume that we're going to, again, as I mentioned, sort of pass through that cost. Just in terms of the growth and usage, we have a pretty nominal sort of growth assumption in there. We do have some growth that can happen here, but not as much as you'd see sort of in other communities, but we do want to recognize that we do add accounts over time. In terms of usage, we've assumed some conservation in the upper tiers for electric and for water, just recognizing that there may be some impacts from the adjustment in the rates, just general sort of conservation that would happen over time, and just making sure that we recognize that in our revenue projections. Because to the extent that we see conservation, we'll have less volumetric and usage revenue from electric and water. And then some specific changes that we were made aware of that could potentially happen that just could impact the revenues is just the conversion of the golf course, those potable volumes to raw, and as well as a reduction needed to meet the water budget. And then for Cascada, a similar sort of reduction to meet their water budget. And Joe can provide additional details on that if it's needed. But just making sure that, those reductions and the shift from potable to raw impacts our revenue. So we just want to make sure that's incorporated in the projections. And then outside of those specific sort of conservation measures, generally we're assuming that things will be relatively flat over time, other than the specific things I've identified there. So that just really impacts the revenue. If we don't do anything, here's what we sort of expect it to be.
Can I ask a question, please?
Go ahead.
So in that comment you made about the potable to raw, if that goes one way or the other or changes in some amount, what could be the plan to account for that if it ends up being a deficit, a net deficit from revenue versus income? Would that come out of our 20% plus?
Yeah, so we've made an assumption in the plan. If it varies from that and it's a negative financial impact, then that would come out of the fund balance yes,
Okay.
that's right.
Thank you.
Can I help clarify that for a minute, just to make sure? So what we've got is you have a reduction in revenue from Cascada, but you don't have any revenue from the golf courses, from the city golf courses. They pay wholesale. They pay at cost. So that's actually just going to be reducing the city's cost of the reduction in water. So, but the Cascada is a pretty big reduction.
Right, and since we project them separately, we just want to make sure that both are reflected. Yeah. Okay. In terms of operating expenses, we start with the budget. We received a preliminary budget, and basically from there, we're just looking at projections for 25 and beyond. So we've made some assumptions working with staff on increases in personnel costs, general inflation, looking at some projections that are available from different sources like the Federal Reserve does inflation projections. It's really anybody's guess, but the expectation is that it is going to come back down. So basically what we're saying on general inflation is that, our 24 budget, we're assuming that that sort of incorporated any general cost increases that we've seen, and that over time we'd sort of expect that to kind of come back down to more normal levels. The exception to that is, the two big pieces that I've identified here for purchase power and purchase water. We've gotten long-term projections from Silver State, so we've incorporated those. Just one note that folks are probably aware of, but that the unit cost for power is about doubled since we did our last study, so that's a big impact. And then we also have additional cost related to a shortfall in what was budgeted for our electric costs and what was ultimately recovered. And that would actually, that's a typo, it should say 24 and 25, but basically that'll be paid, the idea is that would be paid off over starting in 24 and going into 25 to recover that shortfall. So that's incorporated. In terms of purchase water, we have rates for potable and raw volumes, so just an assumption of 5% per year there. I think that's generally sort of related to inflation. So we've got a little bit of a conservative assumption there. I think this most recent one was about 6%. And then there are some that have been lower. And then we have fixed costs from them that basically don't change, so we've just carried those forward, the in lieu charges. And then the other thing we sort of discussed earlier, so I won't dig into it too much more, but just this idea of making sure that we've got those costs from, the central services reimbursement appropriately incorporated. We've incorporated an assumption that that increases in '25. And then generally just recommend that we investigate that. And then I think I touched on those last two already.
Can I make a comment?
Yep.
Are you done with the slide?
Yep, go ahead.
So on the 2C, relating to 2C, I think it is AAA, the additional cost for the $3 million. If I understand correctly, that's sort of a contingency, there is a contingency fund within Silver State, and that $3 million came from that, so there wasn't, I think we need to look more closely if that $3 million needs to be paid all the way back or can be done. If Boulder City has already contributed to that fund as we've gone over in the several years we've been with them, then do we need to pay it all back or not? So it'd just be some funds that might not need to be paid if we just need to if we could investigate that a little bit more. Because we do already have $3 million for the rate stabilization fund. So I think the question I would like to understand is it $3 million that Silver State pulled from their account that wasn't Boulder City's, or was it a Boulder City account that we'd already paid into? So just clarify that. And that's where that's starting, so if we are paying that back, or even a portion of that back, that's where my averaging of the cost would be, I'd like to consider it, because then that would increase the wholesale cost. I think.
Right. Yeah, so my understanding of that is that was a cost to us that we need to pay. If it's not, then obviously we would want to reflect that and make sure that's adjusted. Okay. In terms of capital expenses, we look at the capital improvement programs. The projects, generally speaking, are in today's dollars. We do adjust them for inflation. So a project in today's dollars that we're doing 5 years from now is likely going to be more. So we do make an adjustment for that. We do have the benefit of various sort of what I'll call external to the utilities financing sources or funding sources. In the past, we've had solar lease sort of payments as a financing source, as well as land sales. It's our understanding that there isn't anything new sort of on that front, so we haven't incorporated that into this, but that was an impact in the prior study. We also have the infrastructure sales tax for water, which is a source of funding for water. And then we've had the benefit of getting ARPA funding for water and wastewater projects. So all that's been incorporated. We're assuming that we're cash financing the projects because generally speaking, we have the funds on hand. So no debt financing, just cash financing using the funds we have. And then just wanted to highlight, ways to potentially impact these costs. You can look at the timing of when the projects are done and making sure that those cash flows are appropriately reflected over time. And then just any sort of other sort of creative ideas that may come up. I know there's the potential to reuse transformers that we have for another substation project, so that's potentially cost savings there. And then just the recommendation on the raw water line debt service for the reasons I described earlier. It probably doesn't make sense to accelerate that repayment given the low interest rate. Okay, so the graphic on the right is a stacked bar chart of our expenses. So in that light blue on the bottom, we have our operating expenses, and then the existing debt service for the raw water line, that's the dark blue or the second from the bottom there. And then the yellow on top is cash funded capital expenditures. So basically what you'll see is that, and then the two lines I should note are our projection of existing and proposed revenues. So I mentioned earlier we're proposing adjustments to revenues. So if you look at the kind of solid line, our revenues are less than our projected expenses. So that would suggest the need to adjust the revenues. But one benefit we have here is we have sort of funds on hand above that 20% that we can use so that we don't need to raise that line all the way up to the top of the bar. And we'll look at a graphic that kind of demonstrates that. So just in terms of overall sort of revenue increases, about 4% per year for electric. And I'd say approximately, because that incorporates that that power supply thing, which can sort of adjust from year to year. So that's sort of assuming that we've got that number exactly right, but we're planning to basically, the recommendation would be to set that charge where it needs to be. But assuming the Silver State projection's right, it'd be about a 4% change per year, 2.5% per year for water, and 2.5% per year for wastewater. And just to sort of provide context on that, historically, we typically see increases for utility rates well above inflation. Of course, inflation nowadays is a lot higher than it used to be. But if you think about, more typical inflation being 2 to 3%, utility rate adjustments tend to be in the 6 to 7% range. And that's because, usage is generally declining. A lot of places are sort of behind on capital improvements. So there is some catch-up that needs to occur, which really kind of adds on to what would normally be an inflationary increase. But the good news is we generally have the rates sort of about where they need to be, and we're really more talking sort of nominal adjustments and potential tweaks to the structure this time around, using that the fund balance, that's the FB there, that we already have on hand. So just as a note, if that minimum is kind of 20%, we have essentially over a year's worth of operating expenses now in that fund balance. And we're saying, over time, with these adjustments, maybe go ahead and bring that down to more like 45%. You could go lower, but there are other things on the horizon that are, do cause some uncertainty. The other thing is, the plan would be to review these every, 3 to 5 years anyway. So there's time to sort of course correct over time. If things are better than we expect, we can make an adjustment. If they're worse, then you can course correct the other way. So just sort of graphically demonstrating what we've got there. On the left, you have 2 bars, and that shows those percentages I mentioned earlier. So it's a little hard to see, but it's north of 140% would be the projected end for this year. And then in the gray, it's basically if we don't make any changes, keep the revenues levels where they are, sort of where that would go over time. And then that darker blue line is with those revenue adjustments. So you see we go below the 20% over the 5-year period, which is sort of that's how we look at it. We do dip below that line, and really the idea would be, even though we're okay in the next, 2 to 3 years, just what is an adjustment that we can do sort of equally across time that will get us to where we need to go. So rather than saying, well, we could do a few years with nothing and then have to raise them up much higher, is there a way to sort of smooth into that? And that's sort of what we're envisioning here with those sort of equal annual adjustments over the 5-year period. And the right is just sort of the dollar amount, the unrestricted sort of piece that factors into the 20%, and then we also have an emergency capital reserve and a rate stabilization reserve that can be used sort of under very specific circumstances. Okay.
So the blue line is 20%?
Yes, the blue line's.
Line is 20%?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay, so in terms of the rate structure recommendations, just kind of going through those, one we've sort of started unpacking a little bit is the unbundling of the power supply from the electric rates. And basically what we're saying is our rates now include the cost of our system, which is basically fixed, right? People use less electricity. We still have to have the same substations, the same wires, maybe over a long period of time that could go down. We have the same staff, we have the same trucks. So all those costs are essentially fixed. And then we have this large and growing variable cost in terms of power supply. And what's commonly done with electric utilities is sort of unbundling those two pieces. And there's a number of reasons why you might want to do that. But basically, we would have an energy charge, which recovers the power supply cost, and then a delivery charge, which would recover our internal cost to basically get the customers the power. We can do that with or without making the other changes. So we don't have to make the changes to the blocks to unbundle the rates. I just wanted to highlight that. And we've actually shown it in the handout, sort of the combined impact of those two pieces. So there's no, you don't have to, you can take this one sort of on its own if you like that without the structure changes. It is pretty common for municipally owned electric utilities as well as investor-owned electric utilities to unbundle as well as make adjustments as needed to reflect changing power supply costs. Our costs have sort of been increasingly variable, in recent history, and a lot of that has to do with sort of how much hydropower production we get, as well as the really large increases in the cost of market power due to natural gas prices. So our costs have become more variable, at least recently. They've been, historically very steady. But to the extent that that variability occurs, you want to be able to sort of capture that in a rate that's somewhat flexible. So that's one reason to do it. The other thing is it highlights for our customers sort of what they're paying for. So and I mentioned this, I think, during the last study, but in a lot of communities, power supply cost is, it might be 80, 75, 80% of the cost. So if you're paying a 10-cent rate, 8 cents of it might be power supply. Here we have a lot less expensive power, although it has increased. So it's closer to 40 to 50%, but just so that our customers know when they're paying their bill what's related to sort of factors that, at least in the short run, aren't directly in our control. And just really highlighting what they're paying for. Okay, this much is for the power, this much is for getting the power to my house. So it adds some transparency there. In general, it's not a cost we have a lot of flexibility on. So if we have capital improvements or even some operating expenses, there may be opportunities to defer, delay, reduce, move things around. In terms of the power supply, there's a lot less flexibility in terms of us paying those costs, so we have to recover them. So having a rate that sort of adjusts with that, I think makes a lot of sense. And then the other thing to note is that if our costs go down, we could pass those along as well. So how might that work? I mentioned the two sort of pieces, the energy and the delivery charge. We were looking at sort of a straight pass-through of our unit cost of power from Silver State. So what they essentially, that average that they would charge us, that factors into our bills, that would be the rate that we would use. Now, what that does leave out is that there are some things like line losses or other unmetered uses that wouldn't be captured in that. And basically, that's sort of more of a general benefit that would fall into the delivery charges, as opposed to factoring that into the actual power supply charge. And the reason to potentially do it that way is just to say, we can say, here's our cost, and here's what you're paying, basically. In terms of how the rate might be changed, how frequently it might be changed, sort of getting to your question, there's lots of different ways to think about that. I think the simplest way is probably just to set something and to just allow it to be adjusted periodically. The other way you could do it is say, well, we'll have a rate and we'll only basically be able to move it if our costs change by a certain amount, so sort of have it capped a little bit. But in general, I think the simplest way to do it is sort of we set a rate that we think is appropriate and just sort of have that authority to basically move it when we need to. In terms of alternatives to unbundling it, we could just keep the structure we have and just change it as we need to. So we'll, I think our handout resolutions envision like a 3-year sort of adoption. So we would set those, incorporating what we think our purchase power is going to be. If it's significantly higher or lower, then we just have a new resolution that adjusts them to what they would need to be. The other option is you can leave them bundled, but basically just add the authority to adjust the total rate as needed, as opposed to unbundling it. So more of a power cost adjustment type concept. The other benefit of unbundling is it establishes a little bit clearer linkage between our power supply costs and then the credit that we provide for net metering. So we have that sort of policy there, but it sort of aligns well.
We're going to take a 10-minute recess, if that's okay. Give you a chance to drink some water.
Sure.
Thank you. We're in recess.
Can you get through like in reverse?
How did we decide you spelled your last name?
Drat? Or Raftelis?
Your last name?
It's Drat, D-R-A-T.
Okay.
Yep. It did seem very foreign. I was like, these guys are ready to keep going.
We're going to start off with a question from Councilman Walton for Mr. Dratt.
I want to clarify the potential option of adapting to the increases in rates. So if you
Right.
could expound on that, please.
Yeah, sure. So the idea right now, if we want to adjust any of the rates, we do it by resolution. That includes the electric rates. The electric rates cover our delivery costs and they recover our power supply costs. So if our costs for power supply double, we need a new resolution to basically recover that, or we have to use money we already have effectively. So in terms of the unbundling piece, what the resolution would say is something to the effect of the rate is X cents and it can be adjusted as needed to recover those costs. So basically that would be sort of giving the authority to staff to adjust that rate to what it needs to be.
And to clarify, when we say in that umbrella resolution, it can be adjusted as needed by the utilities department.
Right.
Okay,
That's
so it
right.
wouldn't have to necessarily come to city council for a whole
That-
new
that's
resolution to
right.
change it
That's
to a
right.
new rate.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Please proceed.
Sure. Okay, I think we can move on from this one. And we talked about this one. Okay, so now we're on to net metering. And this sort of fit as a segue from the other one, which is basically let's kind of break out our energy costs. And that sort of informs this net metering policy. So really there's two big components of this. That's how do we determine what credit we provide for folks that are generating? And we're talking about solar generally. There are other forms of net metering, but for the most part, it's solar here. But that net metering is just sort of the way it's generally referred to. So in terms of the credit, right now, we're doing it based on that sort of average cost from the prior year, which in a time where it was always about 3 cents, it was pretty much right. But the prices are moving around and they've increased. So one thing we might want to consider is focusing on basically setting it based on that energy rate, or at least having that be informed by our budgeted costs. We know what our power supply unit cost is going to be because we get the budget.
Go ahead.
Remember, as a generator, we're talking about the wholesale cost of electricity, not the retail cost of electricity. So we have to understand that as a generator of electricity, all people with solar on their roof become a generator. So we're only going to pay them credit for the wholesale cost of that electricity, not the retail.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important clarification. And that's definitely where you want to focus. And the reason for that is if they generate power, we still have the same system. It doesn't reduce the cost of the fixed costs of basically being there when they're not generating, when the sun's not shining. So we still have to recover those costs. So in general, that the way the credit is handled, I think, is appropriate. We may want to do it based on what we expect the cost to be rather than, last year's costs, especially in a time where the prices actually move.
Question about that. Would that then be managed more nimbly by the utilities department or how would that?
Right. Yes. I don't think you wouldn't need to, and I don't think it is now. It's just now we just calculate the average, but basically that you could do it the same way, that either it would be either equal to the energy rate, which is sort of the simplest way of doing it, or you're saying we'll set the credit such that it recognizes, our reduced, power supply cost.
Thanks.
Yep.
And does that have to be done by a resolution also, or just the energy cost?
So how are we envisioning that policy? And maybe that was a similar question. I think, so right now, I think what the resolution says is it's just the average. So that's sort of, it's just a calculation. So the only real change there would be You either say the credit's going to be basically at the energy rate that's set by the utilities department, if that's the way the resolution's written, or you could just say the credit will be set by the utilities department with the understanding that they're generally going to be aligned.
And I think to help clarify one of the big reasons for net metering, as you said before, the biggest thing in Boulder City is solar right now, rooftop solar. And as it's been pointed out in our committee several times, in that really you can only have so much rooftop solar in the city without affecting the city infrastructure. So if you were to get, let's say for some way you'd get half the city decides they want to put solar, so Boulder City's infrastructure couldn't support that. And so what has to happen is what we've been asking for is, I think we really need a workshop relating to solar. So we can get facts out there and we can get understanding into the citizens and everything and understand what the citizens can do and what the city can support. And so I think that's what this is mostly, I believe, is one of the starting points and one of the reasons we asked for the net metering aspect was what do we need to change the resolution to go forward, and then what can we do going forward?
Right. And there are also, and we'll get to this when I touch on 3 here in a second, but there are, the state law informs sort of what you can do on some of these things as well. So that's something we'll have to examine pretty carefully and just make sure that we remain in compliance there. So the other kind of issue is excess generation, and this is sort of what Larry alluded to, which is generally, I think, from an operational perspective, at least the way our system's currently constructed, we want folks to generate what they need as opposed to building something bigger with the expectation that they'll basically be selling a lot of power back. So it's really about sort of incentives. So right now, we provide a credit for excess generation, and it basically carries forward, I think, up to 24 months is the policy. And as we've sort of been alluding to here, is that there's kind of an operational limit to how much we can have with our current system. And so if folks build more than they need, or if they're generally generating more than they need, if there's only so much that can be there, it might, theoretically limit other people that may want to do it too. So one of the recommendations that we often make in these situations is that we not actually purchase the excess power. That said, we, in kind of prepping for this meeting, we did review the NRS a little bit. There's a few lines about basically rights of solar customers, net metering rights. And one of the things that's in there, and this is just me reading it, not providing a legal opinion, but it says you have to provide fair credit for energy exported back to the grid. So we may be limited in terms of changing that component of it. That's something we'd have to investigate, not something I could personally provide an opinion on. One of the things we do now is we limit the capacity of the actual solar installations that people can have to, I think, 80% of the prior 3 years average. So that's another way of basically saying, okay, you're not going to become this net generator that's providing power from your installation sort of throughout the city. If you happen to go over what you need, then we could provide a credit. But in general, we're trying to get the system to basically be sized to what the home would use. So that's something that on that piece of it, if we wanted to adjust that, we might have to examine it. The other thing we could do is potentially adjust the credit period and say, well, it carries forward over 24 months. Just in kind of reviewing some other places, they limit that to 12 months, so that's a potential option. It's just reducing how long that credit carries forward. And then there are other places that limit capacity or even provide sort of lower credit as they add more customers. And that's sort of a technical analysis that might have to be done, like what the impact of that is, but that's another potential option is like NV Energy, for example, has tiered credits. So once they've reached a certain amount of solar, that rate drops basically. But I think in general, what we're talking about is we're generally doing this the way you'd want to do it, which is crediting power supply costs, not getting any credit for our distribution costs. We want to tie it to what we expect our costs would be. That's kind of the primary recommendation. And then just maybe some consideration on the excess generation. We'd have to, again, investigate if we could change that policy, but that is something that we typically recommend investigating. And then the last thing that I mentioned is, or that we've got on there is, if we make big changes, we might want to consider applying that, if possible, just to new agreements. One thing that happens in these situations is folks have kind of made a decision based on the policy you have to have the installation they have. And if you change it and it has a financial impact sort of after the fact, then that can kind of feel unfair. So we could consider, if we make changes, kind of grandfathering and just have that sort of adjust over time. So it may be just new agreements, when properties change hands, that sort of thing, so that over time you've kind of got everyone where you want them, but not make an immediate change to existing customers.
I have a question if I can.
Go ahead.
So much of what we've heard today is a culmination of a lot of effort with staff, UAC, Raftellus, et cetera. But this, you've given some pretty nebulous recommendations. How are we going to narrow these down?
Yeah, so I think that the primary thing is setting the credit based on what the actual cost that we expect. It gets maybe backing up a little bit. I think the policy is pretty good as is. So we're really just recommending tweaks. The one tweak would be, rather than looking at last year's cost, use the energy rate, or at least the cost we expect it to be. Because if the price goes up, we don't want to be crediting at the old rate, or vice versa. So that's an easy change that can be made. I think the excess generation thing, it's really just, how you look at fair credit and what you do, and there's sort of a range. And it is sort of a policy decision. So there's not a right or wrong answer in terms of how much is sort of fair credit. But I will say I didn't see any others that I reviewed, be it energy, NV Energy or Overton or whatever, that provided a 24-month sort of rolling credit. So there's not a right or wrong answer on exactly how generous that is. And the thing you have to keep in mind with some of this stuff is it's not all like 100% cost-based. A lot of it's just, we want to encourage solar, so we have a generous policy because that's what we want, So there's different areas on the spectrum on that.
So the UAC will be taking this matter up a little bit more in detail between now and the next, on May 3rd.
No, we won't. There's none. Well, we can help with the resolution modification, but the major details related to solar is going to take time, and so that's one thing. But we hopefully, to do that, I think we would be good to get another workshop at some time just to talk about solar and to get facts out there and to do it. So a lot of this is going to have to be pushed out, but we can, as Colin said, we can modify the resolution now to help move forward easier.
So some of the tweaks, we'll call them, can happen maybe during this cycle, and then some of the other
Right,
more significant issues. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Colin. Yeah.
Greg's got a comment.
Just so you know, it's not really a resolution, it's in our solar net metering agreement. That is where all this detail is at. And as a solar installer of Solar One in Boulder City, I am one of the authors of that agreement. So I am what I'll call an expert in solar interchange metering.
I had a question, if I heard you correctly. I have solar too, and you said that basically I'm using it during the peak hours when I need to use power. So if they stored it at nighttime, if we actually stored that power at nighttime and then used it at night, or sent it back through somehow at night like they do out there in the solar fields, would that be advantageous to us? I mean, or to the city to maybe help make that rate better for the solar, the people that have solar?
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking if, you could store the power so you weren't using the city as a standby source in the same way, would it impact how we did the policy and the credit? I think it would inform that. But this is like, sort of the outer edge of, I mean, everyone's sort of trying to figure that piece of it out at
Yeah.
the same time as the technology develops. So I would think it would impact it. But that really depends on the specifics, I would think, in terms of how the storage works and that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
But two things, sorry to help. It's, first off, the Boulder City does not have the technology to do that at this time. And most of what they're using is batteries, and that also has some problematic issues with it, also expenses and problematic issues. The other thing to make sure you're looking at solar is that, so when you're generating during the peaking time, if a major cloud comes over and drops your solar, the city has to instantaneously pick that up. That's one of the other major problems with a large amount of solar. So that you have to have the infrastructure to do that, and then it costs the city a pretty good penny to have that ready. So it's, again, we're not trying to be negative, and we're not trying to say we shouldn't have it. We just want the facts out there. That's why this is a complicated issue.
Right. And I would say it's easy enough to change sort of the way we're calculating the credit. That seems somewhat straightforward. The other piece, I think, if you wanted to say we're not going to purchase excess generation, I think that would require some legal investigation just based on a plain reading of the statute. But yeah. The only other thing I'd say before we move on from this is that right now this is not a huge financial issue, so it's not like a decision on this really impacts the other things. So just wanted to note that it's more of sort of a policy question. Okay. So getting into the block rates. So right now we have rates that basically increase as you pass certain usage thresholds. So we're sort of focused on electric first here. So there's a rate for 0 to 2. There's a higher rate for 2 to 4, and there's a higher rate still for above 4. And the idea is to sort of encourage conservation. That's why you have structures like this. I will say that we don't see a lot of block rate structures that go up sort of around the country. They're typically uniform or even declining, which has to do with the load factors of large customers, and there's some efficiencies there. But we have it here. The reason to have it is to encourage conservation to the extent that people have control over that. I think the thing we have to keep in mind is that, you know, for electric especially, there's only so much control you have over how much energy you use, especially in the short run. In the long run, there may be things you can do in terms of increasing efficiencies sort of in your house with your air conditioner. There are other ways of achieving conservation that may be even better than the rate structure, like rebates and those sorts of things. But in terms of the rate structure itself, just sort of are there things that we can do to sort of adjust it in terms of sending that conservation signal. So the way we looked at that was looking a little more seasonally and really just sort of taking that existing structure and just dropping sort of a lower rate underneath that 2 kilowatt hour rate. So we have, 0 to 2, 2 to 4, and what we're saying is, maybe we do a 0 to 1 in there. And the 1 is about the average in the winter. And then as you get to 2, you're looking at more the average in the summer. And then when you get above 4, you're in sort of the top 5% of summer bills. So there are definitely some that would get up there, but it's not very many. And when we look at the actual impact, we're not recommending a big change to what I'll call the steepness of the structure, how much it increases from block to block, but just sort of a tweak there in terms of maybe giving some relief at those sort of lowest usage levels.
If I could make a sorry. Go ahead, Councilmember Jordan.
I'm just curious, you say average winter. How many consumers fall within average winter, that 0 to 1?
So the average is, just sort of thinking through the math here, I mean, if it were completely equally distributed, it'd be about half, but it's not there. On electric, it's closer to half than on water. On water, you have a lot of really large bills, which tend to pull the average out a little bit. But, you know, about half in the winter.
Is that a monthly?
Yes, per month, yeah.
And we would consider winter being which months?
I think I looked at so I was looking at January, February, March billing data. So you'd kind of go to the prior month. Because it's basically billed after the fact. So I was looking at January, February, March.
Is
But
there-
even then, I'm sorry to interrupt, but even if you extend that, there's really only a few months where it really bumps up. I mean, it's basically at or around, you know, 2, maybe it gets up to, you know, a little bit higher. But then when you get into the summer, it actually ramps up quite a bit for just a couple months.
And is there a reason for no 2 to 3?
Not a particular reason why not 2 to 3. I think when you think about what we have, the 0 to 2 and the 2 to 4, the 2 and the 4 sort of align with cutoffs that you can kind of explain seasonally. So it's all about, like, if we're going to have a structure, why are the tiers where they are? And what we did is we looked at, okay, given that we're charging some folks more and some less, you know, what are sort of the average and above average for those different periods? So that's what we focused on. You know, 3 would obviously, you know, fall. It's you know, be above average in the summer, but not quite like the highest bills. So it was really just typically that's sort of how we look at it. And again, these types of structures aren't super common for electric because, you know, you don't have as much control over it. But you know, we do have one, and thought it made sense to maybe drop in that lower block.
Well, and I understand why we would be doing this is probably and most likely to help those on fixed incomes, which I think is a great idea. I guess my only concern would be that you have such a variety in home sizes here in the city. So probably the average that fit within the 0 to 1 would be those under a certain square footage. Clearly, I mean, especially during summer months, and anyone above that then would end up, in essence, being charged more. I would like to call it penalized, but in a sense.
Yeah.
And so I can see why we want to have the advantage of helping those who are on fixed incomes. I just am curious as to why such a small number on the bottom. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, so we went
Yeah.
from 0 to 2 to 0 to 1, 1 to 2. And I'm just wondering, it seems like average summer, what size home would you say an average summer bill of 2 would be, 2 kilowatts?
Yeah, that's going to depend on, I mean, yeah,
You'd say 2,000, Greg?
That's age, energy efficiency,
That-
window.
right. Yeah, there's a lot of things.
That's what
that
the
factor
K
in.
stands for, okay? So 0 to 2,000, 2 to 4,000, and above 4,000 kilowatt hours per month. Now, you have a lot of townhouses, condominiums, mobile homes, okay, that all fit in that 0 to 2,000 category. So what we're trying to do is encourage some conservation by giving them a little bit lower wholesale rate, retail rate, okay? So that breaks it into a different tier. And that's what the resolution's about. We're trying to get these rate structures in these different proposed schedules to work. We haven't gotten to the money per kilowatt on the different rate schedules. But like the mayor said, the abbreviations are damning because K stands for 1,000 and you're saying 2 kilowatt hours per month. No, as soon as you kick on the air conditioner, you're going to burn that up in 2 days. 2
Right.
kilowatt hours.
So it's 2,000.
Right, these are all
Thank you.
Ks and 1,000. So that's what we're looking at. So this is something that the UAC was proposing to give, and we're also doing the same thing for the water because you've got a lot of small businesses that are flat rated out at so many thousand gallons per month. And they've only got one toilet in their little complex or several restrooms for people to use, and they're automatically billed at the full amount, you know, the minimum, which is 0 to, what was it? I think it's 0 to 8.
Residential 0 to 8, it's 0 to 60
60
for
for
commercial.
Yeah, and so that's what they're billed at. So the UAC is looking at all this stuff in our 1-month meeting per month, looking at all this stuff, trying to get it untangled. And this is why we've called Raftellus in back again to help us get some more stuff and some more information. But this is what we're all trying to work on, is to keep our rates as low as possible and make certain that we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot at the end of the year.
But I think the one thing that you brought up, and Ned Chamo brought it up when he was here in the last meeting, was you've got several issues. You've got larger houses, but you also have older houses that aren't insulated and have older air conditioning. Even with and so they're using a lot of power that there isn't a whole lot they can do. So there is a certain amount that we're trying to get it there to say, here's the savings, but I think we're trying to keep it where we don't jump too fast at another tier or so to hurt somebody that can't do anything.
Well, and the other thing I'd point out too is you go through all the blocks. So it's not like if you use more than one, you pay for all of it essentially at that level. So you get the benefit of the lower rate. And that I think comes through in sort of actually looking at the impacts. And so I'll jump to that maybe in a second here, but we're not talking about dramatic changes on electric specifically for exactly the reasons you talked about, which is that there's a desire to encourage conservation on the one hand, but a limited ability to sort of address that with the rate structure on the other hand. So we've got one. Maybe it makes sense to make it better. The other thing I think that's worth investigating is just making sure that that we're doing things on the other side, on the sort of demand management side, with encouraging folks to increase the efficiency of their stuff, whether it's through federal programs or stuff we can do, or rebates or anything like that. That may be an even better way. And to the extent that we make people aware of that, make that available, then maybe we feel a little better about a structure that does this, because we say, well, it's something that you can feasibly do, as opposed to saying, well, you're just going to pay more because you have an older home.
And I think the one thing, since we're all here to bring up, I apologize, I'm terrible at names, but I believe the deceased council member Jorge, I'm trying to remember his last name. Warren, thank you. Had made a great, I think it brought up several times, by just trying to get the houses changed from incandescent light to LEDs could save a lot. And that's maybe what we do. We say, okay, we work with this for a couple of years, and we say, if we can get incentives like that and try to get households and find a way to, he was saying, okay, we're going to charge each person $1 for the LEDs and bring it out and try to get a reasonable amount into the household. Those are things I think we can help to reduce the aspect, but then also other members have brought up, we have to be a little careful in some of these things. Now, we want to encourage that, but if we reduce if we reduce the amount of electricity to a certain point, then we're going to reduce our revenue too. But I think so that's the thing, and that's one thing that we want to do more on in our 1-month meetings to try to figure it out. So there's a lot of variables to work with.
So one of the things that you've mentioned is a rebate system, that I don't think that's on one of your slides, but that is something that we could consider when we talk about the 3% or something like that.
Right.
So you pay at one level up to, and then you pay more on the next level, or then you pay more on the next level. So it's a graduation within the same billing structure.
Right.
And then if you threw a rebate in there, you'd probably catch the person that was 3 instead of 4. And
Yeah.
People like rebates.
And we're talking about, one, it doesn't go, and I'll skip to the graph in a second, but it doesn't change that much right now, and we're not proposing changing it that much. The highest rate where it is a little bit higher, and those are very large bills. I mean, it may be that someone with a small older home that, you know what I mean? So there are outliers probably, and maybe the best way to handle them is not necessarily with this, but with something else. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
Have you studied just what and it'd be very easy to do in Boulder City, what the mobile home parks do, the manufactured homes, just those areas? What is their average usage? Instead of just saying a house versus, because they're not as efficient, a mobile home isn't, as a regular home. So, and the people that are living in these areas are more on a fixed income. So
Right.
have we looked at just what is their average usage?
We have not investigated that specifically. I agree in concept that you'd think that they would use more kind of on average just because of the way the homes are constructed. So I guess what I'd say is, they would potentially be impacted by this. It's have to kind of investigate how much, to what extent that would be. But in general, and maybe I'll just move to it, I just wanted to highlight the actual magnitude of what we're talking about, because I think that helps a little bit. It's like, oh, they're going to pay more, but it's really not that much of a change from what we have. And I'm going to try to get the pointer going here. Nope, I'm not, because it doesn't show up. So what this is showing is basically the change in the usage component of the bill for a customer. So the dollar impact on or the percentage impact on the usage piece of your bill. So basically what's the change of, what is the impact of changing the structure at different usage levels? So if you look at, like, and maybe for context, I should say, the overall increase in revenue that we're looking at generating from this particular charge, after you factor in the increase in the customer charge to $12.50, it's like, 0.5%. So we're talking about a 0.5% increase on average across all these users, and this is sort of how it's distributed. So if you're below 1,000, you'd see a slight decrease on that component of it. And then as you get up to from 1 to 2, you go from, a slight decrease to, 0.4% increase in that component. And then as you get up to from 2 to 4, you're getting up to 1.1. So basically, if you figure if we just did everything on average, it'd be about 0.5%. If you're in those lower blocks, you're going to pay about that or less for that piece of it. And then as you get above that, it would rise to, the 1%, and then getting up to, closer to 2.5%. But again, the 4,000 is the top 5% of bill. I mean, the top 5% of bills in the summer is that above 4,000. Now, percentages sometimes aren't super helpful, so we have dollars that, basically show the same thing. So go down about $1 for that piece of it. This is just the impact of this change. And then it starts to rise to just about under $1 increase, and then, getting up to more of about $4.50. But again, that's a bigger bill to begin with, so that's about a 1% change in that piece of it, not the whole bill, but just that component of it. So we're not talking about making this structure a lot more aggressive, is what I'd call it, like increasing the steepness of the tiers. We're just saying, could we keep that lower one, about indifferent, or maybe a slight reduction was sort of the thought there. Okay.
So according to the two graphs, do you actually give a credit for the beginning of the minus 1.1 or the 0.95? Do you?
It's not a credit, it's just what the change in the bill would be from what it is now to what it would be under the new structure.
So it's just-
That's the impact, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The bill wouldn't go down, especially because we're increasing proposing to increase the service charge. But this is basically isolating the impact of just this decision.
Mm-hmm. And again, that's not the first part of it. There are gradations going up to that.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to flip to water here. So this will be a little easier maybe because we've sort of talked about some of the concepts on electric and they're similar. In fact, I think they're a little bit easier on water. So same idea, we have our current structure that basically has cutoffs at 8, 25, and 60. And again, the thought was, well, can we tweak things to sort of, recognize that difference in seasonal usage? And again, we're not setting rates for individual customers, so there is variation in there. But just recognizing that we have these fixed blocks, does it make sense to sort of tie them to something? So,
What are the numbers you mean?
1,000 gallons. Yes, so those are 1,000 gallons, so it's 0 to 8,000 gallons, 8 to 25, and 25 to 60, 1,000 gallons. So we bill in 1,000 gallons. So that first block is really, as I mentioned before, looking at indoor usage for sort of an average residential home. So that's that 50 gallons per person per day at about 3 people with some room. I just, sort of ran the numbers a little bit on those upper blocks just to see, what the equivalent number of people would be for those cutoffs if you use that same standard. So at 25, it would be, like 17 people if it were all indoor usage, right? And 45 would be about 30. So we're pretty sure at those levels that there is some seasonal sort of outdoor usage component to it that people have some discretion over. And even that's sort of a judgment call that you're making, right? But it's the idea is one way to think about that first block is sort of, indoor usage, human health and safety, that sort of thing for the average person, the average household. So that's where we set that one. And the other thing I'd mention is, again, just like electric, everyone goes through all the blocks. So they get the benefit of the lower rates, even if they end up in the above 45 category. So we have the indoor, the average in the summer, and then as you're getting, above 25, you're above average in the summer, and then above 45 is the top 5% of bills. So that was 60. So we were looking at dropping that to 45 because the 60 is very, very high. There aren't very many bills even in the summer that are that high. There are some, but just dropping it to maybe that 95th percentile level. This is that same graph showing the impacts. This is a little bit more of a change. And again, just recognizing that like on electric, there's only so much that folks can do. So we want to balance that kind of conservation signal with the ability of people to sort of change what they're doing. On water, to the extent that we're pretty sure it's sort of discretionary usage, that's a large component of it, I think we feel maybe a little more comfortable having those rates change a little bit more. So that 0 to 5, again, would be basically a decrease, and that's the impact of that piece of it. And then as you get up to 25, again, we're looking at, maybe a 2% change, and then it's not really until, 45 where things start to ramp up. But again, you're talking about very, very large users at that point, likely to be beyond just a really big family. So that was kind of the logic for that. Just for context, one of the other things that, and I don't know that we really highlighted this, but we're proposing keeping the service charge for water at its existing level, so no increase to that water service charge. If you do that, we'd need to basically increase the usage component about 4%. So just that's sort of the average to kind of compare this to. So even at 25, you're still below that average increase, that sort of average impact, and it's not really till 45, that top 5%, that things really start to ramp up more. And the other thing I'd mention that I didn't highlight on the electric is we originally had the top block at 25 and the top electric block at 2. And one of the kind of the feedback from the committee was that's too low for here, especially on electric, because there are a lot of bills over 2. So looking at it more seasonally and seeing, okay, well, maybe 4 actually, the existing 4 cutoff that we have sort of makes sense. And then similarly on water, even looking seasonally, the 60 sort of struck us as being pretty high because it doesn't really capture anyone in terms of who would actually be sort of sent that conservation signal. This is just the impact.
Can I make an observation here?
Yep.
So as we were talking earlier with Councilmember Booth, asking questions about larger families, myself as well. If my math is right, a family of 5 using 50 gallons per day times 30 days in a month, that's 7,500 gallons. Does that match your math?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay. I'm good at math.
Yep. Yep, that's right.
So that 0 to 5 new structure would hit, and I don't know what average size of family, because Boulder City is so diverse, right? We have
Right.
So the average age of our resident is 52, if I'm not mistaken. So we have a whole lot of households that aren't really large families.
Right.
Lower numbers. So most of the households will potentially come in that first tier, the 0 to 5.
Right.
Right, if that's what we call it. But there's a fair number of families, right, that have 4 to 5 humans inside the house
Right.
that would, just by nature of that calculation, surpass that first tier.
Right. It would be more than it wouldn't necessarily be outdoor usage for them at that point.
And,
Yeah.
and so if our goal was to try and capture indoor use at the lower tier, and I'm not just talking at you, Colin, I'm
Right,
talking
no, no,
to the
yeah,
whole
yeah.
group, right? But I happen to be looking at you.
Yeah, that's okay.
Excuse me. Then there might be value in considering a different number for
Leaving the
0
8
to,
maybe. Yeah,
0
yeah.
to 6 or
Yeah.
whatever to try and offset that typical indoor use for the family, the folks with
Right.
more people in the household,
Yeah.
so.
And
just
some
an
of it gets to really just, unfortunately, most of the time we're stuck with sort of these fixed block structures, and I think we still would be here. One alternative that you can do in places which have a little more seasonality is you can look at average winter usage and say if you're above that, basically you would pay the higher rate. Basically it'd be a percentage. So if you were above 100%, like that's what I pay. That's the structure I pay on in Kansas is we have basically a rate for up to 110% of your average winter usage. And then it doesn't matter how big your family is, right? Because your average winter would be higher. So that's one way to kind of individualize it. Here, since there's not as much seasonality, I'm not sure that would really work. But what I think I'm hearing maybe is that, one, it sort of depends on what size family you assume, right? Maybe even if the average is 3, maybe there are quite a few with 4 or 5 or 6 people in their home. And they would, for that piece of it, they would be paying more for that indoor component. So it's really about sort of, who are you trying to capture there? And it's not so much that there's a right kind of consultant answer to that question. It's kind of like, we have to sort of make a decision on the 5 versus the 8. But,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And real, which is why I prefaced that with
Yeah.
an observation
Right,
only.
right. Yeah. Discussion.
Because just as we're talking about that, and that goes into other ideas about, conservation and things that we're not here to talk about. So I just wanted to point that out to the
Sure.
group and something that we could think about as we consider these structures. Thanks.
Right.
Well, Colin, in our April meeting, made a very good statement. I think it was totally true, is that the rates are as much of a judgment as it is science, or you could even say plug and play. You can't just take these numbers and plug them in. You have to make a lot of judgment calls. And I think that's a big reason we want to get all these questions answered, so we know the proper judgment and not just say, well, here's the numbers plugged into a spreadsheet and here's how it popped out. So I appreciate that
Right.
comment last time, and I think that's a big portion.
I think when we consider that judgment call too, that we need to recognize that a good community has a variety of ages that live within there. And it is hard to get young families to move to Boulder City because the cost of homes is higher, just by the nature of our growth restriction and loving our small community that we do. But I would hate for us to put something in place that also discouraged them further from coming if they had a family. So that they go, oh, if we go there and we have a family and we use, our bill is this much higher because we have a family. Because our schools are declining in population, and I don't think that that would be an unintended consequence, I think, of some of that if we weren't careful.
Right. And of course, the least impactful thing to do would be to sort of leave the 8 where it is. So that's potentially an option as well, and just say, well, what can we do at those higher thresholds that we're pretty sure aren't big families? So that's, potentially another sort of way of thinking about this. And I think when you focus on the small sort of fixed income users, then that's always a trade-off with, the families, because they're going to use more, the same amount per person maybe, but more overall.
The theory would be the regular smaller user would be doing less outside the home, landscaping as it were, that we're trying to figure out how to save our water.
Right.
I mean, that's why we're talking about all this.
Right. Right. Well, and maybe you make changes at the higher levels,
Right.
and that may be the way to sort of address that issue, knowing that maybe at the lower level it's a little harder to tell what's indoor versus outdoor. And again, even like I mentioned before with the rebates, there's other stuff we're doing and will be doing that will have way more impact on how much water we use overall as a community, besides the structure, but that's what we're here to talk about, obviously. So that's just something to keep in mind. This is a tool, and there are other things that we'll do, like with the turf and stuff, that will have an even greater impact potentially than just sending that conservation price signal.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, we talked about that. This is I don't know if I actually touched on this one. This is that same look just based on dollars. So again, you're not talking about a big change, acknowledging the principle that you highlighted earlier on the family size, obviously. But just, the biggest change is really that top 5%.
Yeah, but the big thing is the top 5% in 5 years is a big change. So if we do raise it 2.5% for 5 years.
Right, it does add up.
That last tier gets pretty hefty at the end. So
And
that's something we want to keep an eye on.
And that's the balance between, how much we want to try to use this tool to do this versus, not. So it does have more of an impact, but that's also sort of the idea, right, at some point. So that's just the decision to make there. Just pulled in some example sort of impacts at different sizes and usage levels. Again, there's no, one size fits all on some of these comparisons, but just looking and trying to align the full impact on the bill here. Relatively small customer, on the electric and water side, we're looking at this, this upcoming year about $2 or 2%. And then just as an average over the 5 years, about $3 a month, or again, 2%. And then that, as you get to the sort of more of the average, it's just bumps up to 3 and 2%, and then 6 and 3%. And then a larger customer or a larger bill, again, 2 to 4%. And if we use sort of that mega top 5% user, you'd see their bill obviously go up even more, but there aren't very many that are kind of in that level. So these are just sort of examples, again, with, underlying adjustments of.
Per month, that's what I was going to make sure.
Yes, per month, yes.
Make sure we understand, that's per month, yeah.
Yes, per month.
That's not clear there.
Yeah, so this is per month, and then over the 5-year period, I don't think we're looking at an adoption of all 5 years, but just to sort of show the trajectory with those last couple of years as examples there, with all three sort of stacked up. And again, if we needed to adjust the rates today to meet where the costs were, we would need to make much larger adjustments. And basically what we've got is we've essentially had that in place, and now we're ready to get those capital projects done, and we've got the money basically there that we need. So we're talking about sort of more nominal adjustments to kind of recognize our increased power supply cost, as well as increases in the cost of a lot of the capital projects, which is a challenge we've seen a lot of places. So this is just some commercial impacts. And again, we're not proposing really not proposing structure changes for them. So it's more of just sort of average impacts for them. But again, it's in that same 3 to 4% range. And then you can sort of see the dollars there. But just the different sizes. I think we could look at and some of those issues on commercial, but I think that's something you would want to couple with maybe investigating in terms of a cost of service study. One issue with commercial blocks is there is a lot of diversity, maybe even more so than on your residential side, and really digging into, rather than setting different tiers, you might actually want different classes. So that's something to investigate. So instead of saying, well, 60 is too high, maybe you just need a different sort of grouping that would kind of acknowledge that. And that's something that you could examine in a cost of service study, sort of digging into identifying what new classes would be, as opposed to just making changes within the structure you've got.
And the one comment I'd like to make because I just want to just also add to your statement is that we will not be collecting the money that you really need from the electrical. So it's really not feasible to get the rate we would need to collect because of the excess rate of the increase in the wholesale cost and all the capital that we have to do. So hopefully we will be getting a lot of the capital done in the next 5 years, so that large capital. An example is, in a 5-year period, at one point, the capital was budgeted for $13 million. The next year, pretty much the same capital because of reevaluating and looking at the increases in cost, it went from $13 million to 42. So you basically added $30 million in a 5-year period, and that has to be considered. So that's what everybody's saying is let it utilize some of the cash we do have to help keep the rate at a reasonable rate. But we do have to increase it. But I just want to make sure everybody understands that we are not collecting everything that is needed for electrical. So these rates, we're still keeping, they're going to go up, but we're trying to keep it at a rate that it's not outrageous.
And that's what I sort of alluded to earlier, but you made it a little more clear, is we're looking at the funds as a whole and the performance as a whole. And as long as we're comfortable with that, we're okay with electric maybe taking a little bit more time to get sort of where it needs to be. Yeah. Okay. This is my last slide. Obviously, we can take it wherever it needs to go at this point, but I just wanted to highlight for the group just sort of where we've been and where we're going. We had that initial discussion, met with staff for a progress update, and then had that draft sort of discussion with the Utilities Advisory Committee. And then obviously we're here today, anticipating an upcoming meeting with the Utilities Advisory Committee, and then we have meetings on the budget, and then the rates themselves or any changes to the resolution would be adopted along with the budget on the 26th. So that's just kind of the schedule there.
Thank you. Any other questions, Mr. Dratt?
Can we pull up do you have the slides, the worksheets handy? Can we just run through them real quickly? The rate projections?
Yeah, they can maybe we could bring them up. So it'd be the, I think Joe's gonna work on it.
It's part of the packet. no?
Yes.
Are you
Yeah.
talking about these?
No, that's something that I had created. The other ones are the worksheet, yeah, the end of the presentation.
Yeah, we can get that called up. It's a part
The
of,
reason I was going to bring it up is there's a few things that will sort of help understand what the impacts would be, and part of that, so I was bringing it up. Right now, we're showing that the energy would be suggested at 6.13 cents. Like I said, I think if we do have to repay all the amount, that it might just be the averages to keep 3 years at 6.2. That would take into consideration. Because right now, if we have to pay that 1.35 million in '24, you're looking at actually 6.9 cents. So if we average, we won't have a big hit in just the first year. So we average it out for 3 years, and then in 2 years, we can sort of see where we're at and see where we want to go. But that's so with that slide, it was showing
Right.
6.1, and I was suggesting 6.2. So
that's factored into, just so everyone's aware, it's factored into the plan and the delivery charges at this point. That change would be basically to put that into the energy charge.
yeah, because I
the
think it would
1.3.
really relate to the wholesale costs, not the
Right,
delivery
it does.
charge.
And I think the reason that we didn't put it in there was to tie the current charge to the current cost, and it's sort of it's a recovery of past costs. But I think there's room, there's room to do it that way as well. And in the end, the impact's basically the same to the customer. Because it's either going to end up in the energy charge or it's going to end up in the usage charge, since we basically set that customer charge anyway.
And unfortunately, I don't mean to argue the point, but I will, is that the way you have it set in the worksheets, it's not recovered. If you put it in the electric charge, you will recover some of the cost. If you don't, you're not increasing the delivery charge related to that 1.3. So it would not
Right,
be
well,
recovered.
it's not recovered to the extent that electric doesn't recover all of its costs on its own at this point. If you put it in the energy charge, it would be
That's what-
directly
yeah,
recovered, yes.
yeah.
Okay, I agree with that.
And so
Yep.
I'm just trying to be fair
Yep.
to the city, so it needs to be looked at. And it's not a major harm to the citizens, so it's something I'm trying to keep track of. I'm trying to be as neutral as I can here to help the city and the citizens. And that's what the committee is trying to do. We're trying to look at both. So we don't want to hurt the city and say we can't collect the money, and that's never our intent. So,
Right, well, we'll have to, I guess, you'd have to get it one way or the other from the funds, right?
well, the one reason I'm arguing it so much is that if you didn't put it into the electric fund, or if you did not increase the delivery charge, then you might as well take it from the rate stabilization fund. And we could do that, but we would have to establish that later. So right now, we might as well we've got a lot of funds we need to collect. We need to keep that rate stabilization fund where it's at, probably. But I'm just trying to point out what some of the facts are.
Okay, I don't know where we're getting okay. That's awfully small.
We've all got copies.
Oh, okay.
We don't all got copies.
No, that's different. That's a different spreadsheet.
No, I've got.
So I was just sort of pointing out, I don't want to spend a lot of time. I'd probably like to go over a little if we have some of the other issues, but I think just to sort of go over that a little bit, and if people didn't have time, that's, like I said, the very top of the electric is what I'm talking about, where you see the very top. Thank you, Holly. Then that would be changed, and then you sort of get an idea. So again, to iterate what Collins is saying, if nothing else, I think unbundling it and putting the unbundled rate into the resolution. So it depends on how we say it, whether you say we're going to adjust it during the year or adjust it as a resolution. But by showing what we anticipate to pay for the wholesale and what we anticipate to pay for the customer charge, and that's where you see the $10, and then the committee's recommendation was just to change that instead of a percentage, just to change it with whole dollars. And then I think you keep the rate structure a little bit cleaner that way with the customer charge. And then your usage charge, then that's your delivery charge. And then, but again, your customer charge and your usage charge is what you're trying to collect everything on. That's your O&M, that's your capital, and if you have any debt in water, then that's in the other one that would be collected also. So I think the other thing that has to be considered in the resolution is what is the intent of the service charge. So here we have the customer charge, which is the same as the service charge, which is similar to the service charge, but does not collect the same amount or the same aspect as the water service charge does. So I think that's something that we're not going to have time to really, I was sort of hoping that, in my opinion, that is a rate structural aspect, not necessarily a cost of service, but I still think we're short on time, so we won't have time to go over that into this aspect. But maybe in the future, we need to understand what you would consider putting in the customer charge and what you put in the delivery charge. And that's important, really important when you come into the water charge, so that you're saying, okay, here's a meter. Are you really establishing it around what the meter is? And I think that's one of the reasons that the current resolution has that definition. They were debating about really what's related to a meter, not was necessarily collecting as a surcharge, service charge. So the service charge, that's where another confusing. If you're going to say it as a meter charge, you probably want to say it as a meter charge and not a service charge. So there's some terminology I think that needs to be looked at, and whether we can do that in May, that I'm not sure. I believe that Joe has done some reworking of the resolutions for the coming up as a draft that he included in the packet today, and but we're still trying to figure out how the best way to possibly tweak or just looking at this. But if you see these numbers, I think it gives you a little bit of understanding more of what it was. That was the biggest thing I thought for this. Because as you can see, the residential block for the combined, if you look down there, you see the combined block 4, it gets up to 16.7 cents. So in the 5-year, it gets to be a pretty hefty run. So I think definitely in 2 or 3 years we need to look at it, because we might not need it up there by that time, because hopefully about 28, 29, 30, most of the capital's a big chunk of the capital's going to be done. We're hoping. And again, I don't want to speak for the city on that, but that's what I thought the committee understands. So those things that we want to consider and look at too. So I don't know if you want to bring up the water really quick, and that will just give you a sort of just a quick glance at the water aspect. That should be about 3 pages down, I think, on that one. That's
wastewater, one up.
That's on page 32 of 33.
So as you can see, and if you look at, you can see how the service charge is related to meters, and looking at the large meters, and most of that large meter rate is higher because of that, like I said, the 104% increase that just increased it to a bigger percent. So we sort of lost the rate structure aspect of that between 2017 and 2019, in my opinion. So that's the reason I wanted it. And then if you go down, you'll see that the increase of so you can actually, go down a little bit, Holly, please. Then you see some of the changes. So so you see there at the intent of 2024, for that 0 to 5 it'd be a small factor going from $2.39 to $2.33 for the first tier. And then the second tier didn't really have, as Colin pointed out, the second tier didn't have that big of a raise either, going from basically $2.50 to $2, and that is the same aspect, $2.56. So you're only you're 6 cents more. So, and then then the 2 higher ones are going to what's going to get you in that case. So I just want to make sure that if you didn't have time to review it, that point out a few facts.
So, Mr. Dratt, I think we're okay with you. Mr. Stubitz, do you want to come up and give your input? Thank you, Mr. Dratt.
Yeah, I just want to thank Colin and his team at Raftellus for the work that they've done. This has really been a collaborative effort. So the recommendations that are in the presentation, stem from staff recommendations, committee recommendations, and really a lot of time and effort. I think next steps, like Chairman Carr mentioned, would be looking towards a cost of service study in the future, kind of investigating some particular components like net metering, and, where can we set the cap on that, still allowing individuals to do what they want to do. Some other ideas that I think Councilmember Booth alluded to on storage would be like kind of a time of use rate for residential customers, but that would be for folks that want to go with a battery storage system. And so that could be a lower average rate, and then during peak hours would be considerably higher than the normal rate, say 5 times. But the system would be designed to absolve that charge, and that would be a win-win for both customer and utility. That's some of the products and services that are being offered at our investor-owned utility neighbors over the hill. But I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. But just look forward to the next steps.
Go ahead.
I still go back to this. I'd like to see just what the manufactured homes and the mobile homes, those parks, because I think it would be relatively easy for the city, because I know we're saying it's just going to be a couple dollars, but I would really like to see it proven to me it's only going to be a couple $100 for those folks.
Sure.
Because so many of them are living on such a fixed income that I would be more comfortable if I could just see that it really truly was only going to be a couple dollars.
Yeah, and that's something that we'll be able to gather for you.
Okay, thank
Yep.
you. I appreciate that.
Yep. Yes.
Other questions or comments? Go ahead.
Probably myself being a novice in this field. My question would be, how do we establish wholesale price? I know that we have different suppliers of electricity for us, so do we do a combination of what we're buying it at and do the average? Because some being very cheap and others being quite high.
We do, yeah. So we do that with Silver State on an annual basis. So they manage our complete portfolio of power needs. And so we've got a Hoover A contract that at full capacity is 20 megawatts. The Hoover B is around 8. That's managed through the Colorado River Commission. And then we have the Salt Lake City Area Integrated Projects, or SLIP, and that's Glen Canyon Dam and 8 other federal hydro dams. And then the town site solar, which is 5 megawatts for most of the year, except for March, April, and off-peak in November. And then the rest is market purchases. So Silver State will get an annual budget and then look at our projected monthly needs and then our portfolio of projected supply.
So when we say that we reimburse or give, I believe that you said this, it's at a wholesale cost, not retail, for our net metering for solar. Does that wholesale price vary over time then, or is it an established price for all 5 years?
It does vary over time. It's set annually.
Annually set?
Yeah. Not hourly. Yeah, it's an average rate for. It's the same rate that the city would pay.
Okay, so it's an annual.
Yeah, sure.
So we're all aware of this. Anytime we do battery storage on a residential unit, the one caveat that we do not have in place yet is the fire department has not been notified. When you go to a battery fire, it is a whole different gamut of putting that out. So if we've got any battery storage on residential units, the fire department has to be notified, and that has to come under a special rules, because you do not put a battery fire out with water. So anybody that's thinking about putting battery storage on their house, that has to be passed through public utilities, and then it also has to go to the fire department for approval. That's my past practice.
Thank you for that. That's accurate. I just wanted to highlight some ideas as we move forward to what folks might be interested in that could be win-win.
Any other questions, comments, or observations? If not, thank you, and we'll move to public comment.
Okay,
Well,
thank you.
Artie, can I just bring up my
Yes,
spreadsheets real
please.
quick? So, since we were short on time, I don't think it really, I was sort of thinking we could also use it as we went through. What I wanted to do was I put all of the information from the fiscal year '23, the '23 budget on page 1, and page 2 is the fiscal year '24. That's the budget that's being requested this year. Now, these are mostly from the ClearGov, because what you have is right now we have I was looking at 3 different aspects. You have ClearGov, you have the rate budget, which was just put in for your last budgeted meeting, and a brochure, a great brochure. And then we have Raftillus. So most of this layout is what Raftillus had. And part of what I wanted to see, if you look down below, you'll see maintenance, personnel, technical, supplies, and other, and then the 3 admin funds. And so I think that it has a lot of advantage for council to understand, and the committee has been trying to understand how the different costs are broken out. And so the more we understand, then if there is a big increase in anything, we can sort of understand. So myself, we have to do our best to stay out of the weeds, and I'm trying my best, but I'm just trying to understand more. So I'm not trying to get into the city's business and saying this is right or wrong. I'm just trying to be able to have questions. So I think what we're trying to do is just show the revenues you have, the expenses. So I broke out the expenses for power and water, and I really appreciate the financial group. They added the power cost to the city manager report, and I appreciate that, the power and the water. It's nice, I think, to understand and people to be able to see what that is. So that's what this was. If it has any bearing on how the rates and stuff are, you can see it. But you look at the very bottom and you see the net increase or decrease. And so if in electrical, if we get all the capital projects done, we'll be in the whole $13 million. So the funds that we currently have will be greatly reduced with this year, and then going forward, you'll see next year. So these are the reasons that we do need a reasonable increase. And we've been pushing to not be too much of an increase, but at the same time, the city needs to get what they can to reestablish the funds. So if that's helpful, and maybe even in the budget period, I'm hoping that'll be helpful.
Thank you.
And Mr. Mayor, I did just want to add, as you know, last night when you saw in the city manager's report, we did add the energy charge and the water charge on there, and so hopefully that'll be helpful. And I did just want to point out that Mr. Carr has done a lot of work on this, and so I thank him for that. And this is illustrative purposes, so these numbers were not verified by our city staff, but I just wanted to mention that. But really appreciate him for all of his efforts, and he's always trying to find, looking at what's going on. So we're trying to always provide all the information that we can. So thank you.
Thank you. If there nothing else, then we'll move to public comment. Anyone who would like to come up can come up, or anybody who would like to call 702-589-9629 can call, and there is no other written comments. So anybody who wants to come up, and seeing none coming up, we'll wait another moment for our call-in. And while we're waiting, I've always wanted to do this. Each person will have 5 minutes to speak at the discretion of the mayor or the chair. Comments can be on anything in this particular public comment, and no person other than members of city council, the person who has the floor, shall be permitted to enter into any discussion either directly or through a member of the council without permission of the mayor or the presiding officer. No action may be taken on a matter raised under this item of the agenda until the matter itself has been specifically included on an agenda as an item upon which action will be taken. Did I wait long enough now? Okay, we'll close public comment and we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you, Advisory Committee, for your expertise and help for us, and looking forward to even more. Appreciate it. Thank you all.